Oh, welcome to Houston. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, Randall, and thank you all for turning out tonight. I have a lot to talk about, a lot to say, but I asked Randall to sort of make this a conversation and an interview, and hopefully we will channel many of your questions, and maybe I'll channel some of your answers.
And how's it feeling? Your book reached #1. You haven't had a #1 book. You've written 18 books. This is...
You had to rub it in. No, I just, I never expected it would be #1. I mean, I thought maybe 10, or if I was lucky. But it surprises me because a nonfiction memoir often doesn't get on the bestseller list.
Well, it's so open-hearted. Yeah. Let's get to your book. I love stories about special teachers. Please share your story. In your chapter, you call How Alice Camp Saved Me.
Alice Camp was my 3rd grade teacher. And Randall, up until I reached 3rd grade, I was not just bullied, I was tormented, harassed because of my height. I've always been very short. And I felt like I was worthless. I don't know how many of you, I'm sure some of you were bullied as kids. How many of you were bullied? Yeah, a lot of you. Any of you were held upside down in the boys' or girls' room over the toilet? Now, we don't have to go there in much detail, but I really did enter 3rd grade feeling ashamed of myself. And here was this teacher who, named Alice Camp, who saw me. You know, I do have a theory that I develop a little bit in the book, that in order to see yourself, you need somebody to see you. I mean, see you genuinely. See the person you are. And Alice Camp, for me, did that. She understood not only my sense of shame, but she understood what I could be and what I wanted to be and what I really was, in a way, capable of. And she just brought out the best in me. And she had a great sense of humor. And she was fascinating. I wrote about her. I've written about her a couple of times. I think American teachers are not only important for obvious reasons, but are blamed for issues and things that they have no responsibility for. We ought to be celebrating. We ought to be putting our teachers on a pedestal. We ought to be paying them enough money to get the absolute. We already get very talented people, but we really do need to think of our teachers as very, very special, important people. And Alice Camp really is the epitome of that for me. And when I first wrote about her, I got a message from her daughter, who said that her mother talked about her students. Now remember, we're talking about 3rd grade all the time. And that her daughter, even when I am now, whatever, I'm 78, 79, her daughter was in her 50s and still remembered Alice Camp talking about little Bobby.
Wow. Fantastic. You dedicated your book to your late father, Edwin Reich. You say about your father, he could not abide political bullies. Tell us a story of what happened when your father moved your family to a small town outside New York City.
Well, my father had 2 women's clothing stores. And he wanted to move the family to a place where he could get to both of them pretty easily. I was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania, but his 2 stores were in northern New York State, or mid-New York State. And so he moved us to this little town. And right after we moved in, we were a group of elder men from the town came to the door. My mother thought that they were a welcoming committee, and she greeted them with a smile, and they did not smile back. And she said, please come in, and they did, and they stood. They didn't sit down, and my father greeted them. And my father sort of said, well, can we help you? What is this about? And they said, well, Mr. and Mrs. Reich, this is a Christian community, and you are Jewish, and we don't think you'll be happy here. And my father, I don't remember this because this is what that was related to me. I was 3 years old, but apparently my father decided at that moment that he would never leave this town. And that's where I grew up. And by the time they eventually, those old men passed, and the community became much more friendly. But my father, whose passion, his sole passion, was golf, was not allowed to play on the golf course. And I remember that my identity as a Jew was mostly formed by my parents' feelings and my feelings of being discriminated against.
He felt really like a strong character to me, and he was very anti-McCarthy.
He was a very strong character,
yeah.
And he had very strong opinions. And in the book, I talk about him saying, and he would see Joe McCarthy, and he'd say, "Son of a bitch," but he'd say it so loud that it would frighten me, and I never knew that it was 3 words. Or 4 words. I always thought it was sort of a Yiddish expression or something. But it would be delivered with such anger. When Joe McCarthy appeared on the television, we had a little, in those days, the actual picture tube was very small, and I remember sitting there watching the Army McCarthy hearings. I believe it was 1954, and Joe McCarthy was going on, and my father was getting angrier and angrier, and that is when Joseph Welch, representing the Army, a lawyer, private lawyer, said finally to McCarthy, "Have you no decency?"
Yeah, at long last.
At long last, have you no decency? Because McCarthy at that time was attacking one of Joseph Welch's young assistants for no reason. I mean, it was just like we see today, just demagogically. My father exploded, but just as Joseph Welch delivered that, at long last, have you no decency? Well, that was the end of Joseph McCarthy. And what I talk about in the book is standing up to bullies. That civil society depends on all of us taking a stand against the bullies, against people who are abusing their power and abusing their wealth, and taking advantage of their wealth and power to keep other people down. And when I wrote the book, obviously Donald Trump was in my mind, but Donald Trump had not yet got a second term.
Well, we're going to spend some time on him a little bit later. Don't worry.
I don't want to spend any time with him. But I do think we have to talk about him.
Absolutely. Your memoir highlights some really fascinating people who influenced you. And I wouldn't have thought about John Kenneth Galbraith, an economist, diplomat. You say in your book, quote, "No one has influenced my thinking and sense of what a public life could be more." How did Ken Galbraith shape your vision of what you could be?
Well, I had read all his books as a teenager and as a student. And then when I got an appointment at Harvard, I got to know him, and we became very good friends. Now, we did not see eye to eye, literally, because he was 6'8". In fact, I remember walking around Cambridge, and people would stop whatever they were doing to look at the two of us. But I found in him a great inspiration. He viewed economics, not, as you mentioned in your introduction, not as a mathematical or applied mathematics. He viewed economics very much about power. And when he talked about economics, he really was talking about how society was organized. And it wasn't until years later that I learned that Adam Smith, the so-called father of free market economics, never called himself an economist, never even called himself a political economist. He called himself a moral philosopher, because in the 18th century, there was no discipline of economics. It was all about what is a good society. And that's what Ken Galbraith kept on asking in all his books. What is a good society? And in effect, that's what I have kept asking.
Yeah, and in effect, he was another teacher that noticed something in you that obviously you identified with. There was another tall guy in your book. It's just full of funny stories. I wouldn't have expected you to write a chapter about that you call my illicit affair.
This is very private. I don't know whether we want to talk about it.
Your chapter starts, it began, quote, "It began at one of those interminable Washington receptions I had grown to hate." Tell us about your illicit affair.
Well, first of all, when you are a cabinet secretary, you have to go to a lot of receptions. And when I say receptions, I just mean a lot of self-important people standing with drinks and balancing some little something with their drink and their napkin and making small talk. But feeling very important, and feeling very important because they are in the presence of other people who feel very important. It's kind of a self-important ritual. I used to hate them not only because of the self-importance, but also because I was so short, and most of the politicians in Washington are quite tall. And so I would be spat on, not intentionally. But I mean, it was as if I was at a different level of altitude. And they were all conversing. And finally, there's one fellow who was on the Senate Judiciary Committee. He was saying something that I was picking up some of, but I couldn't hear it all. And I decided I really wanted to hear. So I got a chair and I stood on the chair. And he looked at me and I looked at him when we were about the same. At that time, at that moment when I was on the chair, we were at the same height. And I said, my name is Robert Reich, Senator. And he said, "That's extraordinary. You're this short liberal labor secretary, and what are you doing at my height?" And I said, "I'm standing on a chair." And he thought that was very, very funny. He said, "Well, my name is Alan Simpson. I'm from Wyoming. I'm a senator." And I said, I know, and I disagree with you about everything. But we discovered that both of us had a joy in humor, and we loved our families, and we also were very serious about public service. We didn't agree, but we became very fast friends. But then we decided we wanted to go out to lunch. And the problem was my staff at the Labor Department did not want me to go out to a lunch with a Republican senator because I hadn't even gone out to lunch with all the Democratic senators. They thought it would make everybody angry. And his staff didn't want him to go out to lunch with a Democratic cabinet member because it would just be, everybody would be put off and suspect bad things would happen to him. And so we snuck out. And neither of our staffs knew where we were. And we did that over and over again. So that was my, and then we became very good friends after he left Washington and after I left Washington, and our families became good friends. He died just recently.
You describe a last phone call with him about civic responsibility. It was your last call. I think Biden had just given him a medal. And could you repeat that little bit about your last call, about the pasture?
Well, I said something like, and I don't have my book here, unfortunately, but I said something to the effect of, you are a very responsible man, and I love you, and you're a great Republican, and you care about the country. And he said, well, you do too. And I said, I wasn't a Republican. I was a Democrat, and I was a progressive Democrat, and he was a conservative Republican. He said, there's a cow in a pasture near me who's also, he said, who's also very responsible. He shits right in his pasture and doesn't go anywhere else. And I said, that sounds like a Republican to me. And he just laughed, and that was the last conversation we had.
I hate to move on beyond the funny stuff, but we have to talk about. So, as Labor Secretary for Bill Clinton, and we'll get into any.
Oh, you're gonna pass over my date with Hillary.
Oh.
But I don't want to be a spoiler. I want you all to read this book. So I'm not going to talk about my date with Hillary Clinton. But I dated her before, when she was still Hillary Rodham. I want you to understand that. And I also introduced her to Bill. There's a lot more in the book.
Well, thanks for doing that. You write in your book, and you're very candid. First of all, when you were Labor Secretary, your accomplishments, you helped raise the minimum wage, you implemented the Family Medical Leave Act, and so much more, but you're candid about the Clinton administration missing an opportunity to reverse inequality. I mean, Bill Clinton campaigned on putting government back on the side of working class. So what happened?
Well, first of all, you have to understand, I met Bill Clinton when we were both 22 years old. So he was an old friend by the time he became president. And I could, as with any old friend, when you're alone with an old friend, I could call him Bill. I didn't call him Mr. President when I was alone with him. And I felt that he was succumbing to a kind of illusion that had been created by Wall Street. And that illusion was that if he didn't get the federal deficit under control, which, by the way, was much, much less than it is now. I mean, we can really talk about it being out of control now, but then it was way within bounds. But Wall Street and Wall Street's ambassador to the Clinton administration, Bob Rubin, nice man, but we saw the world very differently. And Rubin convinced Clinton that if he didn't get the deficit under control, Alan Greenspan would raise interest rates. And if Alan Greenspan raised interest rates, the whole economy would start to collapse around Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton would not be reelected. So that was the drama. I felt that Bill Clinton should not listen to Wall Street, not be intimidated by Rubin, and that he had a better chance of being reelected if he did what he said he was going to do: invest in education and infrastructure and job training and all of the things that we now call social justice. It was a very difficult period of time because the press was playing up, as they always do, playing up every confrontation, every dispute in the administration, and it was a real dispute. But it was very, very difficult to get through. I remember, because of my height, I was the only person who could actually get to Bill Clinton when he was in his limo and sit on the jump seat opposite him. And I would do that. I'd find out when he was leaving the White House, and I'd run, get in the limo, and I'd sit there, and he'd look up. He'd say, "Bob." I'd say, "Yes, I'm right here, and I need to talk to you." And I had a captive audience. And I would do whatever I could to try to convince him that he didn't have to worry about Wall Street. Well, ultimately, I failed.
It sounds like you take that so personally. I mean, that the administration, didn't take this opportunity. But do you think, like you yourself personally, Robert Reich, failed?
Well, I failed, Randall, in the sense that there wasn't anybody else in the administration who was making the arguments I was making. That is, remember, this is the first Democratic administration we had had for years. I mean, you had basically Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, and then Bill Clinton, 12 years of Republicans. And it was very important, I thought, that we make substantial changes. But Ronald Reagan's influence, the shadow of Ronald Reagan still fell over America. There was still a lot of concern about various issues that the country should not be concerned about, and there was a willingness to do things that the country should not be doing. And what I tried to show in the book is that many of the decisions that were made by Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, and then subsequently by George W. Bush and even Barack Obama, laid the seeds for Donald Trump. That is, Trump is not the cause of what we are in. He's the consequence. He's the ultimate outcome. But the failure, we came up short. That's a good name for a book. No, the book, obviously, there's a double entendre. Coming up short is about me, but it's also about what I saw, particularly between 1980 and 2016.
Yeah, let's go there. So you've explained that working class people are angry about affordability, being left out of economic gains for 40 years since Reagan, and that's set up, this anger and frustration set up Trump, the conditions for. But how did America get to this place?
Well, this is where it becomes a generational memoir. Because in 1946, I was born, Bill Clinton was born, George W. Bush was born, Donald Trump was born, anybody who was anybody was born. How many of you were born in 1946? Anybody? Yeah, all of you. Dolly Parton. Cher. We're all over. there were 61 million baby boomers, and I remember demographers puzzling, well, how did you get a baby boom? Why are so many people born? And it always struck me as fairly simple. My father was in the Second World War. He came home. There was my mother. And that was the same for my entire generation. But what the greatest generation, as it is known, my father's generation, bequeathed to America was not just peace and not just stopping Nazi Germany and the Axis powers and Japan. What the greatest generation did was bequeath to us the largest middle class the world had ever seen. A country that, because of the GI Bill, because of a lot of innovations and changes that were made during the 30s and in the 40s, we had an opportunity, all of us, beginning after the Second World War, to create a sustained and larger democracy and middle class. And I think that's the key to understanding what happened, is to understand that we were on that road. We were not there. I mean, black people were still second-class citizens. Women did not have full rights and opportunities, but we were on the road. And then, if you look at the data and if you look at what happened, the Reagan administration really marked a U-turn, a profound U-turn. Up until then, from 1946 to late 70s, but really early 1980s, the median wage continued to rise with productivity. But after that, the median wage, that is the wage of people smack in the middle, began to stagnate. And more of the nation's wealth and income went to the top. The rules of the game changed. They changed in ways that I could talk about with you. I talk a little bit about in the book. But the most important point is that power shifted. Because as wealth and power moved to the top, as wealth moved to the top, power also moved to the top. And certainly by the 2008 financial crisis, when the bankers got bailed out and homeowners lost everything, a lot of Americans thought, justifiably, that the game was rigged against them. And that's when you get the Tea Party movement on the right and the Occupy movement on the left. Both of those movements saying very much the same thing. We want a democracy that is not run by big government and big business. We want a democracy that's not rigged. And who comes out of the Tea Party movement and who comes out of the Occupy movement? The direct lineal descendants of those two movements are, on the one hand, Bernie Sanders, and on the other hand, Donald Trump. Just one more point, because when this all became very clear to me in the beginning of 2015. I was doing research on a book and also on a documentary called Saving Capitalism. And I went through the Midwest, and I went through the Rust Belt, and I interviewed a lot of people, including many of the people I had met when I was labor secretary, including their children. And I asked them in these free-floating focus groups, well, who are you interested in terms of the next president? Because at that time, Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush were the putative nominees. And I heard again and again and again, I can't tell you how many people said, well, we're interested in two people, either Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump. And I remember looking at them. I said, did you say Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump? I mean, you mean you're equating Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump? But the point is that so many people I ran into and interviewed wanted someone who would shake the system up, someone who is not part of the establishment, someone who would actually was not even officially a Republican or a Democrat, somebody who was authentic. I kept on hearing that word, authentic. And they, for reasons that I get into, they fell for Donald Trump, and the Democratic Party mistakenly did not nominate Bernie Sanders.
You talk about Reagan and this big U-turn. What specifically about Reagan, what actions precipitated this big U-turn to?
Well, there were many actions, but I think one of the most important that is not talked about very often is Ronald Reagan's administration began to do several things. Number one, reduce taxes, particularly on higher income people. And number two, turn their back on antitrust law and enforcement, allowing monopolization of more and more of the economy. And number three, make it extremely difficult to organize labor unions. In fact, encouraging the private sector to bash unions. Those three, and I could give you many, many others, but those three together began the erosion.
You also mentioned the Powell memo, 1971, and that was the moment that floods of money, corporate money, started getting into politics. And I was fascinated to read in your book that this extreme inequality is unique in America, that Japan and Germany, their citizens, continue to enjoy rising standards despite the same globalization trends America deals with. So they didn't have the same pouring into money into politics, but this is a unique American problem.
Well, it's a unique American problem partly because of the Supreme Court's interpretation of the First Amendment. We have a Supreme Court that has said that money is the equivalent of speech and that corporations are the equivalent of people. Now, if you think money is speech and corporations are people, well, you're already way down the road toward the dominance of very wealthy and big corporations on your entire political system. And I think that it was also, though, the Powell memo, which, as I get into in the book, in 1971, I was not paying attention to what the Chamber of Commerce of the United States was doing. But they asked an attorney from Richmond, Virginia, a little-known attorney named Lewis Powell, who became a Supreme Court justice, Lewis Powell, to write a memo that they could distribute around the country to CEOs about what it was the business community needed to do to respond to what the Chamber of Commerce felt was a very dangerous situation. That is, raiders, not corporate raiders, but Nader's raiders, Ralph Nader's raiders, were becoming more and more prominent in the environmental movement, in the consumer movement, in various, and even the labor movement was becoming a little bit more too prominent for the Chamber. And the Chamber was worrying that all these interest groups were eroding corporate profits or eroding the capacity of the nation to be competitive. This memo, which went out to every CEO in the country, said, you have got to start pouring a lot of money into American politics. And that was the beginning.
Let's move on a little bit. I'm curious about your view of Joe Biden. You did say that in your book that he almost revived democratic capitalism. We started to bend the curve a little bit, that he organized the market for the common good. What's your, and I wish he'd have more time, I think another term, maybe the country would be less polarized if the middle class felt hope and some, sense of revival. What's your perspective on Joe Biden?
Well, I think historians will count his presidency as a success in some very important respects. That is, he revived antitrust enforcement. He also was on the side of labor unions, and he was the first president to be on a picket line. He legitimized a lot of what presumably a lot of the people in this auditorium care about, and I care about, in terms of social justice. And Joe Biden, I think, will be remembered, unfortunately, for the debate in which he basically could not perform and for his failure to communicate. I mean, he did good things, he had good ideas. I think the legislation that he came into office supporting, that Joe Manchin and Sinema did not want, I think was very good legislation, but he couldn't sell it. He just could not sell it. A tragedy, and I think people will regard it as a tragedy. I think Joe Biden's decision to step down was a noble decision. It was too late. Kamala Harris didn't have much time. 3 months is not enough time to sell yourself. But I think that ultimately, Joe Biden's vision of democratic capitalism, of the structure of capitalism, was probably as close as we are ever going to get to the kind of capitalism that we need.
I think I remember Joe Biden talking about himself. His investment created all these hundreds of factories and put people to work, and wages were starting to come up. And Biden said himself, we should have put a sign out, so to speak. This is what Joe Biden did, and sell it, in other words.
Well, Biden, in that respect, Biden is sort of the opposite of Trump. Trump puts his name and his image on everything, everything that is people like, and takes no responsibility for anything that happens that people dislike. Joe Biden was just the opposite. Joe Biden, a lot of the initiatives that the Biden administration took went through the states. It was money that was transferred from Washington to the states. Governors took credit for a lot of it. Joe Biden did not get credit. And I think that the notion that Joe Biden's spending somehow triggered inflation misses the point. We would have had much more suffering from the depression or recession from COVID than we ended up having because we spent money to avoid that. That is a success in my book.
I lost my train of thought. Well, wasn't the supply chain disruptions a major cause of this inflation? Suddenly prices just went up for everything because of the disruptions and the scarcities.
Yes, I mean, it's inevitable. I mean, if you have a pandemic, and we hadn't had a pandemic since 1918, so we had no records or no good procedures for knowing what to do. But now it's pretty clear. If you have a pandemic and everybody has to stop what they were doing, I mean, the economy is going to collapse unless the government steps in as the spender of last resort. John Maynard Keynes understood this in the 1930s. Franklin D. Roosevelt sort of understood it in the 1930s. We got America back to working because of the Second World War. Well, this was the equivalent of that kind of mini equivalent of the Second World War. So we had to spend.
Well, let's talk about Democrats. Did you
You
see?
really want to talk about Democrats?
We have to, yeah.
Okay.
I'm depending on you to give them some ideas. So,
Right.
this morning's New York Times, I don't know if you had a chance to read it, an alarming front page report. Democrats have been losing profound amounts of registered voters for the last 5 years. And as you've said, Democrats are losing because we're not addressing affordability issues of the working class. Are there any candidates that stand out to you now that seem to get economic populism?
Well, first of all, let's be clear. or let me be clear about what economic populism is. You've got the Republican Party with Donald Trump embracing cultural populism. That is, making people in the United States who have been stressed economically for years, they have not had a raise adjusted for inflation. Their children are not doing better than they were doing. They feel that the old social contract is no longer holding. And what the Trump Republicans have said is the reason for all of your stress is because of immigrants or because of LGBTQ plus people or because of socialists or communists or the deep state, and they've come up with these boogeymen. And what the Democrats needed to say and need to say right now is no, that's not the reason you are struggling. The reason you're struggling is because of monopolization, because of the lack of unions, because the game is and has been rigged. There's too much money in politics. We have to get big money out of politics. And there are a lot of other things the Democrats could be saying, but the essence is they've got to enable the public to see that the stress, the economic stresses are not coming from the boogeyman that the Republicans are setting up. But the Democrats have been silent on a lot of this. Bernie Sanders was the exception. A few people like AOC and now Mamdani and others are telling it like it is, but there need to be many other. And I think one of the reasons that the Democrats at Democratic Party as a party, and I'm talking about Chuck Schumer and others, they are reluctant to embrace the story that is the real story, is that they're reluctant to bite the hands that feed them. That they are so dependent on big corporations and Wall Street and extremely affluent people for campaign donations that they don't want to tell the real story. In the campaign of 2024, 10 people were responsible for contributing $3 billion in that presidential campaign. Most of it going to Trump and Republicans. We had one person who contributed $500 million. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when we didn't have this kind of money in our campaigns. It is ludicrous. And after the Nixon administration and after the scandals of Nixon, we had some public financing of election that worked. It worked pretty well. And we could go into detail about what happened to it, but we've got to make that a major issue again.
Yeah, you would think, well, here are these people depending on big money, the Schumers and so forth, establishment Democrats, but they're losing. This report in the New York Times is profound. Democrats have been losing registered votes by millions for the last 5 years. So why don't they?
Why aren't they learning?
Yes.
Why aren't they learning?
Why aren't they learning?
Well, let me now give you a hopeful story. Because all across the country, I've been tracing young Democrats, progressive populist Democrats, who are making major inroads, who are succeeding in even red states. And I think we are on the verge, we are on the cusp of a revival. Now, whether we call it the Democratic Party or a progressive party, or we don't give it a label, we will see something very big in the next, I would say, the next 2 election cycles. I see it. I already see it. There is a void in American politics right now, and some young, progressive politicians are beginning to fill that void.
Can
you look incredulous.
No, I'm just wondering I'm just so curious, who are they? What does this look like? Can you?
Well, if you read my Substack, I mean,
I read it twice a day. I guess I missed that one.
I have talked about many.
I guess I want more hope. So. More example.
Let me give you another reason for hope. In the last year, I have heard more people who I otherwise would not have believed talking like this. They've talked about due process, the rule of law, democracy. They've talked about, and they've talked about it in detail with kind of passion. Now, these are people who used to take for granted much of what we as a society used to have. But we don't have much of that, or at least it's being challenged. We're in a national stress test, and we all know it. More people are now more sophisticated about gerrymandering than I have ever seen. And that level of knowledge, now this is the professor in me, that level of knowledge about democracy and due process and rule of law and gerrymandering and everything else, that level of knowledge is very important for our system, because there's no way people are going to be able to make the decisions that we need people to make unless they understand what's at stake. I mean, here in Texas, you are all now witnessing something that is extraordinary and depressing and horrible. But having gone through it, it is a very important thing. I can see in California, people are saying, well, wait a minute, if Texas is doing that, shouldn't we be doing this? And then some people in California are saying, no, that's a race to the bottom. And then others, including me, are saying, it's absolutely the way of avoiding a race to the bottom. If so-called blue states get together and we pledge credibly to offset any additional House seats that so-called red states are now creating, we can take away any motivation to do it. It's like mutually assured destruction.
Do you see some of this happening? Are you following Governor Newsom in California closely, maybe some other blue state governors?
Yes, I'm not only following, but I've been on the telephone with many, with his people. And it's what I want to suggest to you, and again, this may sound, I hope it doesn't sound far-fetched. I have a great deal of faith in Americans. I have a huge amount of faith that when people understand what's at stake, they do the right thing. Not always, not always. But we are now not only in a national stress test, but we are also now in a national learning experience that nobody expected to be in. Nobody expected it would happen this fast. Nobody expected that America would succumb to something that looks and feels a lot like neo-fascism. But it's happening. And people are learning very, very rapidly. And I can't tell you, I go out to the eastern parts of California, and believe me, eastern parts of California are very Republican and very conservative. And I talk with people, and I'm having different conversations than I was having just 5 years ago with people. There's a degree of concern about the democratic system, small d, that I've not heard before. And the question that people really are talking about is, how do we save democracy?
What would the mechanics of that look like? So we're getting this brand new awareness, wider spread. How would that translate into putting the brakes on Trump?
Well,
I think
the way to do that, I mean, Trump, remember, we're dealing with somebody who tried an attempted coup against the United States. Someone who called up state secretaries of state and governors and said, give me certain amounts of votes after the 2020 election. Someone who was actively intimidating state electors. Somebody who was telling his vice president, I want you not to certify this election. In other words, we're dealing with somebody who has absolutely zero respect for democratic institutions. Zero. We have coming up a midterm election. In midterm elections, the party that occupies the White House almost always loses the House and the Senate. I mean, even if you had the best president you could imagine. Donald Trump knows that. And what is Donald Trump doing? He is plotting another coup. What are the aspects, what are the elements of that coup? Number one, he's calling up red state governors and saying, I want you to gerrymander like mad. Number two, he's saying, okay, I'm going to do trial runs of getting the Army and the National Guard in control of Democratic-run cities, where most of the Democratic voters are. And I want to intimidate. I want to see how far I can go in intimidating people. And number three, he is beginning to plot how he can basically stop mail-in ballots and take over election machinery. Now, all this is being reported, but it's not being reported as it should be, holistically, as that this is the man who we know after 2020 tried to overthrow this country. This is what he is planning to do for 2026. This needs to be seen as a whole. And I think that the Democratic Party, let's not even talk about the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party, in my experience, is mainly a big fundraising machine. And that's good. I mean, we need a fundraising machine. I would prefer that we didn't have to do a fundraising, but it's not like a political party was maybe 40 years ago. It doesn't have the kind of grassroots element you need. But I think that what we need to do, we are the leaders we've been waiting for. I think many of you need to do it here in Houston. We need to do it all over this country. We need to stop these three attacks on our democratic small d process. And we see them beginning. We need to stop it through the courts. We need to stop it in terms of our own legislators, state and federal. If they're Democratic legislators, we have to make sure they know that we're watching. If they're Republican legislators, we've got to appear at their town halls, and we've got to be very, very vocal about what is happening and what we expect from them, or we're not going to vote for them again. And we need to use the power we have, the power of boycotts. I think people don't understand the extent to which a boycott of certain companies and products can be very, very powerful. Look at Tesla or Home Depot, I could give you a number of companies because I was at the Federal Trade Commission years ago. I dealt with a lot of these companies, and as Secretary of Labor, I dealt with a lot of these companies. These companies are highly, highly dependent on their public image, their brands. They don't want those brands tarnished. A boycott is hugely important. And finally, I think we need to, and we can, exercise far more power than we are in terms of expressing ourselves nationally. Now, some of the things that have happened, many of you might have been involved in the June 14th exercises, the No King's Day. That was actually beautifully done because it was decentralized. And the press is starting to get it. The press is starting to report on these decentralized demonstrations. We don't want centralized demonstrations. Thank goodness the progressives around the country have not all gone to Washington to protest what Trump is doing in terms of taking over Washington. That would play into his hands. Then he could, declare the Insurrection Act applicable, and he could pull out even more troops. No, the decentralized protests are very, very important.
It seems to me these protests, these decentralized protests, affect congressmen. We only need to flip, 3 or 4 people, say, in the House, so it turns Democrats. Congress people are definitely are mostly survivalists.
They're mostly survivalists, but the Republican members of Congress have been so intimidated by the possibility of being primaried by somebody on their right. And Trump has credibly, and Trump with some of the money that he's now pulled in, has credibly threatened to primary these people. Now, that threat of being primaried has got to be countered by our threat that if they don't act responsibly, we're not going to vote for them, or we're going to vote for their opponents.
All the questions that came in, and I want to get to them now, they're all about fighting for democracy. Steve's got a question that relates to something you just said. He wonders if it's something more than timidity and fear of Trump. Steve wonders if it's more about Republican opportunistic power seeking. He wonders, what have you learned about power? The personality of a power seeker is kind of a personality disorder. You've been around.
Well, I can tell you a couple of things. First, the only way to deal with a tyrant, and we are dealing with a tyrant, is not to appease him, not to give in to him. Now, how do you, so let me just say, if you're Harvard University and the tyrant comes after you, what do? You fight. You also get together with every other prestigious university in America, and you have a common goal and a common front. And that's something that the universities have not done. They need to do it. Columbia should not be the only university out, or Columbia and my alma mater, Dartmouth College, they've basically given Trump whatever he wants. You can't ever appease a tyrant. And the same thing with law firms. In Washington and in New York, several of these law firms have given Trump exactly what he wants, and now he wants more. What the law firms ought to do is get together. The American Bar Association ought to pull them together in a common front that says, no, we are not going to give in to you at all. The same thing with media companies. I mean, the saddest story. I was on Stephen Colbert's show last week or the week before, I think, and seeing and interacting with the stagehands and all of the other people on the Colbert late night show, and they all know that it has to end. It's going to be ended in May, and they know why. They know that CBS's parent company, Paramount, gave in to Trump. And they feel it, and they feel they feel angry, and they feel sad. But it's the same at the Washington Post. I know people there who were columnists who have left, people at the Washington Post who can't stand the fact that Jeff Bezos has given in to Trump. Well, you see, we can support all these people, again, going back to boycotts. I mean, Jeff Bezos is incredibly vulnerable to a product boycott in terms of Amazon. I tell people, if they want my book, don't get it through Amazon. You see, my point is this, that a tyrant is going to use whatever methods of intimidation and control he can find to suppress dissent, to suppress any opposition. And it is our job to find every opposition, every instrument of opposition to unite people against that tyrant. That's our job. That's what we will be doing. That's what we have to do. That's what all of us have to do over the next few years.
When you're on the phone with these movers and these players, I'm wondering if you could offer them this idea. I think the 4 living presidents should get together, make a statement together, and say this is not normal. Bush, Clinton, Obama, Biden.
Well, the 4 living presidents, 3 of them are Democrats. And the credibility of Democratic presidents to make the statement that you just said, this is not normal, is not great. What we need is George W. Bush. And anybody here who knows him, please make sure that he knows that he has, I think, a very, very large and significant role to play. Barack Obama, just a couple of days ago, Obama has been much more vocal than he's been in the past. But Obama knows that he's a Democrat. He's a black man. He's not the most credible person in terms of getting to the people who need to hear the message.
Do you see any movement with the mayors? I mean, Trump is threatening some occupation of all these Democratic cities, 20 or 30. What if they banded together and sued together in unison?
Well, the mayors should and will and have to some extent. But again, most of these big city mayors are Democrats, and many of them are people of color. And again, if we're going to try to get the message across that we're dealing with a tyrant and we have to unify against the tyrant, we don't want to allow the tyrant to play the game of divide and conquer. And that's what he's been playing. He uses, he's been playing this for years. His campaign against diversity, equity, and inclusion is really a not so veiled campaign against people of color. And it's got to be called out. I mean, I don't know what is wrong with diversity, equity, and inclusion. I like diversity, I like equity, and I like inclusion. Why should we go along with this?
There were several people that heard you on Colbert talking about the Gilded Age history. And part of your optimism, as I understand it, comes out of that the Gilded Age resulted in widespread outrage and led to a progressive era. What actionable lessons can we gain from that recovery? And one of these questioners said, is this going to take long? Is there anything we can do to accelerate the...
Well, the analogy is overreach. That is, when you have great inequality that naturally results in corruption, because the institutions, the companies, the corporations, the trusts, the monopolies that have that kind of power use that power in ways that undermine democracy. And we saw that in the Gilded Age, the turn of the last century, where it was so blatant that the captains of industry that we actually called robber barons would tell their underlings to put sacks of money on the desks of pliant legislators. This was, but we had also something that we still have, and that is a courageous press and writers and people who would alert the public to what was going on. Now, the investigative reporters we used to have, like Woodward and Bernstein, we don't have that many. Some have been intimidated, and again, we've talked about the Washington Post, but we still have a number around the country. Many of them write for the New Yorker or the Atlantic, or they write for many other outlets. They are very important to this story because their precedent, their antecedents, the people who were playing this role in the first part of the 20th century were called muckrakers, muckraking journalists. And they showed the public what was happening. Going back to my theme about the American public being basically very decent, caring about democracy, caring about fairness. They showed the public what was happening, and the public rose up and said, no, we don't want it. And that was the beginning of what historians call the progressive era. Many very important reforms.
This is a very emotional question, and it's pretty typical. Bethane asked, what can she do for her daughter? She says, I keep my 17-year-old educated and informed. I encourage her to write letters to elected officials. We go to protests, but things are getting worse. What can we do to ensure our children and grandchildren will have a decent country in the future? It kind of also reminded me of your chapter about the long game.
Well, it's hard to talk about this in the sense that many of us are absolutely shocked at what is happening. And some of us are in a kind of state of depression. And I understand it. I feel it on some days as well. But there is a very, very important difference between pessimism and depression and cynicism. The difference is it's perfectly fine to be depressed, to be pessimistic, to think, this is horrible. But it's not appropriate to be cynical because a cynic says nothing can be done. Nothing can be done. A cynic feeds off of hopelessness. And what Trump, and I'm calling them, and you'll excuse my expression, neo-fascists, want is for us to be cynical. They want for us to give up. They want us to basically go home and do nothing, because then they have it all. Then there's no opposition. Then they win. And what we have got to continue to tell ourselves through our agony, through our depression, through our fear, is that there is no giving up. There is absolutely no giving up. That this is the fight, in some sense, of our lives, in terms of the legacy we give to our children and grandchildren. These institutions that are being wrecked right now are so critical to the future. We will rebuild them. It's going to take time. Some of us, maybe we won't be around by the time they're rebuilt. But I think they will be rebuilt more strongly than they are now. For the reasons I said before, because people now understand what's at stake. They didn't understand before. I mean, born in 1946, I took for granted much of what cannot now be taken for granted. I assumed the institutions of democracy, checks and balances, 3 branches of government, of the federal government, federalism, Basically, I assumed that people in public life would be acting in good faith. And I assumed that even CEOs of big corporations, corporate leaders, would also be acting in good faith. I assumed that everybody had a stake in making the system work. Well, that can no longer be assumed. But that is not a cause for utter dismay. That's a cause for education, for re-education, for fighting, for making people see what is actually happening.
I'd like to finish with two questions. One, your advice to young people, and your advice to older people. For young people, it's important to discover talents and gifts. And I was really struck with the way you expressed your strong feelings when you discovered your talent for teaching. You described the instant you started, you experienced what you call an aliveness. What's your advice for young people finding their talents?
I would say to young people, and I say this to my students, you have a lot of talents. It's not a question of finding your talents. It's a question of finding work that is meaningful to you. It's not a matter of finding your bliss or finding your joy. It's a matter of finding meaningful work. And meaningful work can come in many, many shapes and sizes. I tell many young people who are understandably very fearful about not having enough money to get a house or an apartment or to live by themselves, I tell them that there are many ways of earning enough money to live on. That is not your problem. If you are a graduate of a college or university, you're fine. Not always, but basically you're fine. I worry about the young people who are not college or university graduates. And by the way, one of my sons, I have two sons, one of my sons, Sam, I don't know, and if anybody...
Got a following, sound like.
Well, Sam, the reason some of you applauded is you might know about Sam. Sam is doing extraordinary things. But I have to tell you one thing about Sam. When he was 16, I'll tell you what he's doing, but I'll first tell you about what happened. When he was 16, Sam sat his mother and I down, his mother and me down, and he said, I don't want you to think that I'm acting out. I don't want you to feel like I'm blaming you. I don't want you to be angry with me. I just want to tell you, I'm 16. Legally, I can leave high school, and I'm leaving school. I'm dropping out. But I'm not acting out, and I have a way of financing myself. I have a job in a music store, and I'm getting an apartment downtown, and I'm moving in with Elaine. Now, I don't want you to worry about me at all. I'm fine. Well, now, some 20, 30 years later, Sam runs a huge company. It's an entertainment company. It's called Dropout TV. And he's still with Elaine. And he is Sam is, to me, the inspiration for what almost anybody can do. Sam did it on his own. He never asked me for a penny or for a contact or anything. And he knew what he was doing. He did what was meaningful to him. And I would say to all parents, say that to your kids. And when they tell you, even when they tell you they're dropping out of high school, and I was appalled. I mean, I could barely stop shaking. just love them. Just love them to bits. That's the most important thing. Now, as to you older folks.
Well, let me set you up, okay?
Oh.
Sorry. You said you were tired because you're losing, and I love this word, you're losing fizz. This is just such an amazing, comprehensive word, fizz. So I guess I'm asking for, how do we maintain our fizz?
We maintain our fizz through being passionate. Now, what a lot of people say, you're writing every day on Substack, you're doing this, you have a movie out, you do a book. What do I don't consider that work. I consider it therapy for me to deal with my anger. It's my passion. There's really something that connects a lot of what I've said and what we've been talking about and the questions you've had. And what that theme that connects it all is that we're living in a very, very special time, a very unique time, a time that is demanding extraordinary things from all of us and putting all of us through hell in many ways. But it is also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to find in ourselves activities and states of mind and ways of being that affirm our values, that give us hope. People say to me, where am I going to find hope? I say, in you. They say to me, where am I going to find leaders? I say, in you. When I say we are the leaders that we've been waiting for, I really do mean that. I have seen too many politicians, and I've been very close to many of them. In fact, one of them I've known since he was 22, and I've been advisor to others. We can't expect them to rescue us. They will not and cannot rescue us. We have to rescue us. My class, which I miss terribly, but I retired from teaching my big class at Berkeley. I used to introduce myself by saying, I advised Barack Obama, and I was Secretary of Labor for Bill Clinton, and I worked for Jimmy Carter at the Federal Trade Commission, and I could see, by the time I got to Carter, their eyes would start glazing over. I was in ancient history, and I said, I worked for Gerald Ford. They had no idea what I was talking about. And then I said, and I was special assistant to Abraham Lincoln. And they used to laugh at that. And then about 3 years ago, I saw them just writing things down. That was the clue to me that I really had to leave.
Robert Reich, thank you for a beautiful evening. Here's our clock. The top line says, "Thanks for making us taller."